I'm not sure how to start or explain this, but recently something happened with my husband that has left me feeling hurt, embarrassed, and confused. It's been weighing heavily on my mind, and I haven't been able to bring myself to talk to anyone about it yet. Just for context, my husband, Ken, is 7 years older than me. We met when I was 21 years old and at a really low point in my life. My ex used to be abusive and manipulative, so when I met Ken after my breakup, I found him to be different. Or so I thought. He was the perfect boyfriend to me and was the complete opposite of my ex. He would plan all our dates, was a good listener, and knew what he wanted in his life. He told me very clearly on that he was looking to date someone who he could eventually get married to. Since he was older than me, I was not sure if I should continue to date him as I was not sure about marriage. But as we continued to date, I slowly kept falling in love with him. Now, Ken doesn't have any parents as he lost them in a car accident very early on in his life. I think this was a big reason as to why he always craved having a family of his own. When we started getting serious, I introduced him to my family, and my parents absolutely loved him. Ken was charming and confident, and I could see that my dad immediately liked that. Even my older sister, Jamie, had no negative comments about him. I remember very distinctly that Jamie had commented to me that Ken was a great catch. During this time, my sister was single, so I would often invite her to join us whenever we went out. It was great. Three of us always had a blast together, and I loved seeing them get along so well. There was never a hint of anything more than friendship between them. Eventually, my sister started dating her boyfriend Fred, and we all continued to hang out as couples. While our boyfriends weren't exactly best buddies, they got along fine and we enjoyed spending time together as a group. However, I would notice sometimes that Ken would get really riled up while talking to Fred. Fred was basically a happy go lucky chap who believed in crystals and astrology. Now, there's nothing wrong with that since he and my sister bonded over it, but Ken was vehemently opposed to it. He would tell me things like how my sister deserved much better than a lunatic, or how Fred was a weirdo. I would try to let it slide. However, once the four of us had gone out for dinner, nowhere fancy, and usually we would each take turns to pay. It was Fred's turn and he didn't have the money, so he asked my sister to pay for it, telling her that he would pay her back. Hearing this, Ken openly mocked him, saying how a real man never lets his lady pay, and how he could take care of Jamie much better than him. We all froze in shock, and I stared at him incredulously. Ken tried to backtrack, saying he meant that she was a sister to him since he was my boyfriend and could take care of her like a family. I shook my head but kept my mouth shut at that time since I didn't want to make things more awkward for us publicly. Later, when I confronted him, he insisted how he had grown close to my family and cared about them like his own. He told me that Fred needed to do better, and I asked him to butt out of their business. I told him that he had no right to speak that way to my sister's boyfriend, and I wasn't going to let it slide the second time. Since then, Ken has kept his mouth shut around Fred. Ken continued to have a good rapport with my parents throughout our dating phase, so it was no surprise that when he proposed to me, I said yes. I did have butterflies and felt anxious about my decision, but I did believe that Ken was the one. We had a grand wedding, and I have to say that Ken left no stone unturned in giving me the wedding of my dreams. My parents did contribute partially to our wedding, but Ken shouldered the major parts. All my friends and cousins were really envious of my wedding and told me how lucky I was to have found an older guy who had his shit together. Throughout all my wedding planning, my mom and Jamie were very much involved in making sure that everything went to plan. We went on a honeymoon to Hawaii, which was a place I had always wanted to visit one day. Ken and I had a wonderful time and everything seemed to be going smoothly for us. The trouble only happened after we came back home. Ken was at work and I was working from home. I work as a graphic designer for a foreign company, so I have the luxury of working remotely from anywhere. There was a knock on my door, and I thought that maybe it was the delivery man. I opened it up to see a pregnant woman standing on my doorstep. She told me she was looking for Ken. I told her he wasn't at home at the moment, but I would be happy to take a message for her. She looked at me intently, biting her lips nervously. I could feel like something was wrong, so I asked her if she was okay. The woman started to cry and asked if she could come in. I was a bit apprehensive, but she genuinely looked pregnant and I didn't want to be cruel. I let her in and gave her a glass of water. Once the woman had calmed down, she asked if I was married to Ken, and I nodded. She then went on to tell me that she had no idea about this when she slept with Ken 4 months back. My stomach dropped as I stared at her and could feel the ground beneath me shaking. She told me she is pregnant and doesn't know what to do since she doesn't want children. She told me how she wanted to abort but didn't have the courage to do so. Hence, she had tracked down my husband from his LinkedIn page. She told me how she had followed him back from his office to our home yesterday evening, but couldn't let herself knock on our door. Since it was a Saturday today, she assumed that he would be home and had come to confront him. Unfortunately for me, my husband was working, hence I was the one who opened the door to her. My heart felt like it dropped into my stomach. I couldn't process what I had just heard. The man I was married to, the man I had supported through thick and thin, had betrayed me. I rushed to the bathroom trying to make sense of it all. How could someone I thought was sweet and kind do something so awful? I had been nothing but supportive and loyal throughout our entire relationship. It felt like a punch to the gut. I started to hyperventilate and everything felt like a bad dream. The woman kept crying and pleading with me to calm down, and I felt sorry for both her and me to be in this predicament. I called my husband and told him that he needed to come home immediately. I don't know whether it was the way my voice was shaking, but he did leave work in the middle of the day to drive back home. When he entered the house, his eyes fell on me sitting with the woman. Immediately, I saw his face drain color. I knew then, without him even admitting, that the woman was right. My husband had indeed cheated on me. The love of my life had got another woman pregnant. Tears ran down my face as my husband came up to me and got down on his knees. He started to tell me how this was all a mistake, and he never meant to hurt me. I kept asking why he would do this to me, and he told me that it was just a one-night stand and that it meant nothing. He then went on to explain how 4 months ago he was too stressed out with our wedding planning and met her in a bar when he and his co-workers were out drinking. She approached him and he found her attractive. They hooked up in the bathroom and that was that. To her credit, the woman agreed with him and told him how she thought she would never see him again until she found out she was pregnant. I shook my head and informed Ken that his one mistake was now going to cost us because she is pregnant with his child. At that moment, I wished I was never married to him. My heart was in pieces. Ken shut his eyes when the lady informed him that she was pregnant with twins. He then asked her, since she was just a stranger to him, so there was no guarantee that it was even his children. The lady agreed to do a paternity test. She told us how she didn't want the babies or any child support. She had been thinking about giving up the babies, but decided to inform him before she did that since he had a right to know. She told us that we could decide and let her know whatever we wanted, and then she left. The next few days, Ken continued to plead with me to not leave him. He kept telling me how that woman meant nothing to him and that he wasn't in the right mind. There were so many justifications that he came up with, which all boiled down to him saying that this would never happen again. I felt like I was walking through a fog during those days. I would stay curled up in my bed for days because I didn't know what to do. I did want to leave him, but at the same time I felt like I would slip into depression. Everything felt different and broken. I could still remember how devastated Ken looked when the woman told us that she would be giving up the babies for adoption. Ken and the lady did end up getting a prenatal paternity test, which proved that it was indeed his kids. Up until that time, I had a bit of hope that maybe she was wrong, but the pain returned after when I saw the results. Ken sat me down and informed me that he had always wanted to be a father and how this should be a blessing for both of us. I looked at him pissed as he continued to explain how we should think about adopting the babies from the woman. Hearing this, I started yelling at him, asking him if he had in fact gone crazy. I told him that there was no way that he was going to suggest something so ridiculous to me. But Ken tried to pacify me, saying how we were always going to have children down the line, so why not adopt the kids when we have the opportunity to do so? He told me how God was giving me the perfect opportunity to never have to worry about getting pregnant down the line since we would already have these kids. When I was still not convinced, he started talking about how difficult his life was when his parents passed away and how difficult living in an orphanage was. I knew that this was a dark phase in his life, and he did go to several foster homes, which scarred him even further. Ken broke down in tears and begged me to think about this in a cool mind and reconsider my decision. I asked him about what would we even tell my parents, since his cheating incident was embarrassing enough, and I could not let my family find out that I was not going to raise his affair kids. Ken winced at the words and told me how I knew that the woman meant nothing to him, and that when it came to the children, I had nothing to worry about since we could always say that they were adopted. I started to laugh and pointed out how that might be difficult since the kids might start to look like him, but Ken told me that we would cross that road when we had to. He assured me that he would take care of me and the kids and we would be one big happy family. Ken is a really smooth talker, and for the next few days I did catch myself mulling over his idea. It was true that the woman and Ken had no emotional connection, and she seemed like a nice person, since she had been quite truthful to me. She definitely had no intentions about keeping the children, and it didn't make me sad thinking about the twins going into the system. If I didn't leave Ken and decided to stay with him, I don't know if Ken could ever recover from that situation, knowing his children were growing up in strangers' homes. If I did decide to leave Ken, I would have to come clean about his cheating, and this would just hurt my parents as much as it had hurt me. Besides the cheating, Ken was a good husband to me, and I didn't want our marriage to end so quickly. I didn't know if I could forgive him completely, but I decided that if we did decide to adopt the twins, we needed to go about this the legal way. When I informed Ken about this, he was beside himself in joy. He assured me that he would contact a lawyer and ensure that we would have proper documentation of the woman giving up the child to ask for full custody. We also needed to discuss how we could adopt them. I won't get into the details, but this was a long, strenuous process. Throughout all this, I never once told my parents or Jamie anything, and no one was the wiser. The pregnant woman was more than helpful to us and had no issues signing all the papers we needed to adopt her babies. She was happy that she was leaving her kids with us, since she also felt bad about giving them up for adoption. When she went into labor, Ken and I were really stressed, since hers was a high-risk pregnancy, but thankfully nothing happened. She and the twins were both okay. When I held the twins for the first time, I felt like all the hardships I had faced until then were somewhat worth it. I didn't even know I was crying tears of joy while holding them until the nurse pointed it out to me. We brought the babies home, and since then I have found another purpose to live my life. The hardest thing at that point was breaking the news to my family, who had no idea about all of this. My parents were shocked and immediately rushed over to our place. Ken and I stuck to our plan and informed them that we had applied for adoption and had been selected to be the twins' parents. My mother started to cry as she checked on the babies, and my father was taken aback but did hug me while saying how he could not believe that his little girl had babies now. I got so emotional hearing that. The rest of the family, including Jamie, did come and visit us, and they were all surprised with our decision, but understood. No one doubted us, and I was glad, since I didn't want to deal with explaining the truth to them. Besides, I had chosen to let go of Ken's mistakes, and I just wanted to move on with my babies. Trevor and Jack are the best boys I could have ever asked for. They are just adorable and are what you would expect boys to be. They have red hair like their mother, which is probably why no one has ever suspected, until now, that they could be Ken's children. Ken is a doting father to them, but the boys love me more than their father since they are still children. It's been 4 years since we brought them home. Throughout all of this, a lot of things have changed between me and Ken. We have shifted to a much bigger place to accommodate the 2 boys. I have been promoted at my job, so I earn quite well for the first time in my career. We did go for couples counseling, and Ken has done everything in his power to be patient and loyal to me. My sister Jamie and her boyfriend Fred had tied the knot 2 years ago. Their wedding was fun, and we all had a great time. However, 3 months ago we found out that Fred was leaving Jamie, which was quite a shock, since they had been dating for a long time. Fred never disclosed to my parents any reason, but since he and I had a good rapport, he told me how he had found out that Jamie had been cheating on him with a co-worker. This was a huge shock to me, since I had no idea about this. I did try to talk to Jamie about it, but she told me that she didn't want to talk, so I let it go, since I wanted to respect her space. Jamie had to move in with us since the house belonged to Fred's parents, who wanted her out immediately. Ken and I were more than accommodating to her. Jamie was also a good aunt to our boys, so I was glad that she could live with us until she was ready to get back on her feet. Ken was always sweet to my sister as much as he was to me. If he brought me flowers, then he would buy her flowers also. If he brought me an expensive gift, he would buy her a lesser priced jewelry. It would irk me, but my husband and I were doing well for ourselves, so I would let it slide. Besides, Jamie deserved to be pampered a bit since she had been feeling lonely after her divorce. However, I started to notice more and more about how close they were getting. Jamie would always touch his arms or laugh a bit loudly at his jokes. She would also comment to me how sexy she found that my husband took care of the children without bothering me. Last week, when I and my husband were sleeping, his phone vibrated because he got a text. Ken always has this bad habit of keeping his phone underneath his pillow, which means every time his phone vibrates, I can feel that as well. Call it a woman's intuition, but I felt something was definitely off. Ken was snoring, so I quietly took his phone into the bathroom. I knew his password, so I unlocked it to see that an unknown number had sent him a message saying, "I miss you." My heart dropped, and it felt like all my past fears came spiraling into my head. I felt like this was déjà vu and immediately woke him up. He sat up, groggily, asking me what had happened when I shoved the phone under his nose and asked him to explain himself. He stared at the phone for a second and told me that he had no idea who this was. He pointed out to me how this could have been sent to him by mistake, and since this number was not even saved on his phone. He calmed me down as I was pacing around the room and told me how I was overthinking. He assured me that he would never do something like this and had learned from his mistakes the first time. I did feel a bit calm since his explanations did make sense and there were no other messages exchanged between him and that number. I almost forgot about it until yesterday when I walked into my house. I had gone out for groceries, but it was raining, so the store was closed. The twins were watching TV with the volume really up, which was almost deafening. I was about to lower the volume when I heard moaning from upstairs. I looked around and could not find my husband and Jamie around. I walked upstairs and realized that the sound was coming from our bedroom. I swung the door open to see Jamie doing the unspeakable with my husband. A small gasp escaped my mouth as I fell back to the ground in shock. Ken noticed me and went white as a sheet. He immediately put Jamie aside and looked like he had seen a ghost. Jamie, on the other hand, looked nonchalant as she quickly got dressed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My own sister, my best friend, had betrayed me. The pain and anger surged through me like a tidal wave. I felt like my world was crumbling around me. How could they do this to me? How long had this been going on behind my back? I wanted to scream, to lash out at them, but I was paralyzed by shock and betrayal. Before I could even process what was happening, Jamie spoke, her voice dripping with arrogance. "Looks like you caught us, sis," she said, her tone mocking. "Guess you're not as smart as you thought." I started screaming abuse at her, telling her how dare she come into my house and sleep with my husband with my kids downstairs. Jamie looked unfazed and replied back that she had done no wrong since she and Ken were in love with each other. Ken immediately started to shake his head and deny this, but Jamie told me how it was clear to her that I wasn't a good wife to him and that I did not appreciate him as much, so she had decided to take matters into her own hands and started to flirt with him. One thing led to another, and she slept with him twice, both times when I was out with my boys doing some work. Only today I had gone alone and came back home earlier than expected. She said she saw an opportunity to take what she wanted, and she didn't hesitate to seize it. Ken tried to approach me, his face a mask of guilt and regret, but I couldn't bear to look at him. The man I had worked so hard to trust again had betrayed me in the worst possible way. But I was more pissed at my sister and her justifications behind why she would sleep with my husband. I screamed at her that I could not bear to look at her face and that she needed to leave the house immediately, otherwise I would call the police on her. Jamie yelled back at me that it should be me who should leave this house, since this was technically Ken's house. She told me I had no right to tell her anything and that I needed to move out with my 2 kids. Ken started to protest, but I stopped him. I looked my sister straight in her eyes and told her, "Fine, but the kids stay." My sister looked at me confused, and this is when I revealed to her that these were technically my husband's kids, since he had slept with another woman years back and got her pregnant. Of course, I would have never left my kids here, but I just needed an excuse to tell her the truth about Ken. She had clearly thought of him as this great man when he was nothing more than a coward and a cheater. The shock on her face was so evident that I could almost feel it. As she turned to my husband demanding explanations, he confirmed the truth of what I had just disclosed. I could feel some kind of satisfaction as I watched her process the truth. She asked my husband why he had not mentioned it before, and he replied that it was none of her business, and went on to clarify how, although he hooked up with her 3 times, including today, he didn't love her, nor did he want to pursue any kind of relationship with her. Jamie's eyes widened in shock, and she asked slowly what he meant by that. Ken went on to tell her that he didn't have any feelings for her whatsoever and had made a huge mistake giving in to her. Jamie broke down. Ken asked her to leave the house so he could talk to me, and knew that having her around would distress me even more. With tears streaming down her face, she packed up and quickly left. I took my boys into their room as I didn't want them to sense that something was wrong. Ken later came into the room and asked me to talk to him. By then, my mind was already made up. I told him in the living room, away from the boys' earshot, that I was done with him. I asked him to pack up and leave, since I could not leave with the boys. He started to plead and cry, but I was so done with his bullshit that I stopped him right there. I told him that he had done what he thought was right for him, and now I was going to do what was right for me. He tried to protest, but I stood my ground. In the end, he did leave with the suitcase full of his clothes. He told the boys that he was going on an urgent work trip so they would not feel something was amiss. This all happened yesterday, and I have woken up today feeling broken. I feel really bad for the twins who probably have no idea that their parents are going to split up. I grew up with parents who still loved each other, and I don't want to subject my kids to the ugliness of divorce yet. I know it would be the right decision to leave Ken. Would I be an a-hole to my kids for divorcing their dad? Update 1. First of all, thank you so much to everyone for your kind words since I wrote this post last week. I am shocked that a lot of you have reached out to me with similar stories, and this has given me the assurance I need that I am heading down the right path. The twins do ask about their dad sometimes since it has been a week, but then they get easily distracted with their toys. Ken texted me this week saying that he is living in a motel at the moment and sent me several long messages saying how my sister was to be blamed for all of this and how she seduced him. I have left him on read. I have no idea where Jamie is, and I honestly do not care. She has not contacted me once since leaving the house. Update 2. First thing I did this week was talk to my parents. I knew Jamie would never have the balls to tell them anything, so when I turned up at their place unannounced, they were surprised but happy to see me and the boys. When I finally told my parents about everything, they were shocked beyond words. I know a lot of you had written to me and that maybe my parents would not believe me, but in my case, my mother didn't even hesitate before hugging me as she and I broke down in grief. My dad looked pissed and started to say how he could never forgive Jamie for doing this to me. Then I told my parents that I had even bigger news to tell them. My parents looked at me worried as I confessed to them about how the twins were actually Ken's kids and were not adopted. My parents' expressions morphed from concern to disbelief as they grappled with this new revelation. They questioned me as I revealed to them about Ken's cheating incident with another woman and how we had adopted the children from her. My parents sat quietly for a moment, looking stunned. I told them that even though the twins were not biologically mine and a product of Ken's discrepancy, I no longer cared about it since I had officially adopted them and I was their mother. I loved them like my own since the first day I brought them back home. My parents assured me that they always have my back, and if I wanted to fight for custody for the children, they would be happy to help. My dad told me that he would help me find the best lawyer in our town so I could start preparing for my divorce. Update 3. Hi everyone. It has been 3 months since my last update. Many of you have reached out to me asking for an update on my situation, so here I am. I'm currently separated from my husband and we are going through the divorce proceedings. Ken and I did talk to the twins about our divorce, and even though they didn't understand all of it, they were sad that we were all no longer going to live in one house. However, we tried to lighten the mood by highlighting the silver lining, the opportunity for double celebrations like Christmas and birthdays. As for Ken, he has offered apologies repeatedly for his betrayal of my sister. While I appreciate his remorse, I have chosen to take his words at face value without placing too much weight on them. For the sake of my children, I want to be polite and civil to him. My parents found out a few months ago that Jamie had been couch surfing with her friends, too ashamed and humiliated to reach out to anyone. However, when her friends no longer wanted her, she had no choice but to reach out to our parents since she also had no job. My dad refused to let her in and let her know that she was no longer his daughter and that he was disgusted with her. I know my mom must be hurting to refuse my sister, but to her credit, she did support my dad. Jamie begged and groveled, but eventually had to leave. I have blocked her since a long time ago, so she has no way of contacting me. And if she ever comes to my property, I will straight away call the police on her. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.